2 generations after the flood, a man decided he didn't need God. His name was Nimrod, and what he built wasn't just a tower, it was a system, a religion, a way to control multitudes through fabricated gods. The idolatry that infected every civilization in history, from the Egyptians to the Greeks, from the Romans to this day, it all began with a single man who wanted to be worshipped. But to understand how this happened, you need to go back to the exact moment when humanity started over from zero. The flood had ended. The waters that covered even the peaks of the highest mountains had finally receded. The ark rested on the mountains of Ararat, a region that today lies in eastern Turkey, bordering Armenia and Iran. 8 people descended from that gigantic vessel. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. They were the only living human beings on the entire planet. Try to grasp what this means. Everything that existed before, cities, cultures, technologies, entire populations, had been swept away. The earth was empty, soaked, covered with mud and debris, animal carcasses everywhere, uprooted trees floating in giant puddles. Absolute silence, where there had once been multitudes, and those 8 people carried on their shoulders the responsibility of restarting human civilization from scratch, without infrastructure, without tools beyond what they had on the ark, without anyone to help them. Genesis chapter 9 records what happened shortly after. Noah built an altar, the first altar in the post-flood world, and offered burnt offerings of clean animals. The text says that God smelled the pleasing aroma, and then he made a covenant with Noah. He established the rainbow as an eternal sign that he would never again destroy the earth with water. He promised that as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night would never cease. And he gave a direct command. Genesis chapter 9 verse 1. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Fill the earth. That command was specific and intentional. God wanted humanity to spread out, populate all regions, occupy the entire planet. It wasn't an optional suggestion, it was an explicit commandment from the Creator. The same command had been given to Adam in Eden, and now it was repeated to Noah. Spread out, multiply, occupy every corner. Noah lived another 350 years after the flood. Genesis chapter 9, verse 28 records that number. He died at 950 years of age, the 3rd oldest man recorded in the Bible, behind only Methuselah and Jared. This means Noah was still alive when his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren were born. He was still breathing when the population began to grow exponentially. He could still tell with his own lips what he had seen with his own eyes. The ancient world destroyed by wickedness, the ark being built while neighbors mocked, the rain that wouldn't stop, the waters rising until they covered mountains, the moment when God personally closed the door, sealing the fate of ancient humanity. That memory should have lasted for generations. It was living testimony, walking proof of God's power and justice. And indeed it lasted, but not in the way God expected. Genesis chapter 10 is known as the Table of Nations. It lists the complete genealogy of Noah's sons and how all the peoples of the earth descended from them. Shem fathered the Semites, from whom would come the Hebrews, Arabs, and Assyrians. Japheth fathered the peoples who occupied Europe and part of Asia. Ham fathered the peoples who occupied Africa and Canaan. But in the middle of that genealogical list appears a name that breaks the pattern, a name that isn't simply mentioned in passing. It receives special attention, detailed description, almost a biographical profile inserted in the middle of a list of names. Cush fathered Nimrod, who began to be mighty on the earth. Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. The Hebrew word used here is gibor. It doesn't simply mean strong or valiant. It means tyrant, conqueror, despot, someone who dominates others by brute force. The same word is used to describe the antediluvian giants in Genesis 6, the Nephilim, men of renown who filled the earth with violence. And the text continues, Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. That phrase became a proverb. When someone wanted to describe a brutal, dominating, ruthless man, they would say, like Nimrod. His name became synonymous with tyranny. But the expression before the Lord is ambiguous in Hebrew. It can mean in the presence of, indicating that God was watching, or it can mean against, in opposition to. Many ancient scholars, including the historian Flavius Josephus in the 1st century, interpreted it as direct defiance. Nimrod didn't just hunt animals, he hunted people. He hunted souls, and he did so in open rebellion against the God who had just destroyed the world because of wickedness. The following verse reveals the scale of what Nimrod built. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Resen. Between Nineveh and Calah, this is the great city. Put this in perspective. Just a few generations after the flood, when humanity had barely reorganized, when the total population of the earth probably didn't exceed a few tens of thousands, a single man already dominated an empire. He had built not one, not two, but at least 8 cities. He controlled territories stretching from Mesopotamia to Assyria, an extension of hundreds of kilometers. Nimrod wasn't an ordinary tribal leader. He was the first emperor in human history, and Babel was his capital. The land of Shinar lay between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a region that today corresponds to south-central Iraq. It was incredibly fertile. The rivers overflowed annually, depositing rich sediments that transformed the plain into one of the most productive agricultural soils in the ancient world. Warm climate, abundant water, land that produced enormous harvests with minimal effort. It was the perfect place to build a civilization, but it had a serious technical problem. There was no stone. The region was an alluvial plain, formed by millennia of mud deposits from the rivers. Clay everywhere, no nearby mountains to extract building blocks, no rock to carve. The solution was revolutionary for the time. Genesis chapter 11 verse 3 records, "They said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' And they used brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar." That technical detail seems insignificant, but it completely changes the equation. Sun-dried bricks, the common method of the era, are fragile. They crumble in rain, crack under pressure, limit the height of constructions. But kiln-fired bricks are different. The intense heat transforms clay into ceramic, a durable material that resists water and supports much greater weight. And the tar mentioned in the text was the natural pitch that seeped from the ground in various regions of Mesopotamia. It was waterproof, adhesive when heated, perfect for sealing joints between bricks. With that combination, fired bricks joined with tar, they could build enormous structures even without access to stone. And that's exactly what they decided to do. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves so that we will not be scattered over the face of the earth." Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. Pay attention to the words, "so that we will not be scattered." God had explicitly commanded 2 generations earlier that they scatter, fill the earth, occupy all regions. And the first great collective work of post-flood humanity was a deliberate project of disobedience, not out of ignorance, by conscious choice. They knew what God had commanded. Noah was still alive to remind them, and they chose to do exactly the opposite. But the tower wasn't just political rebellion against an inconvenient commandment. It was something much deeper. It was spiritual rebellion against the very nature of God. Archaeologists discovered in the ruins of ancient Babylon and other Mesopotamian cities structures called ziggurats, step towers, built in levels that decrease as they rise, with external ramps or stairs leading to the top, and at the highest point invariably a temple, a sanctuary where priests performed rituals to communicate with the gods. The best preserved ziggurat, the one at Ur, had a base of 64 meters by 46 meters and rose in 3 levels to an estimated height of 30 meters. The one at Babylon, rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar 2,000 years after Nimrod, had a base of 91 square meters and equivalent height. The Tower of Babel was the first ziggurat, the original prototype from which all others derived, and its purpose wasn't simply to reach heaven physically, as if they wanted to build a ladder to God. It was to create a portal, a point of contact between the human and the divine, controlled by humans. Think about what this means. Noah had direct access to God. He conversed with the Creator, received personal instructions, offered sacrifices that were accepted without intermediaries. Anyone could approach God through a simple altar, a sincere heart, an offering brought with faith. But Nimrod wanted something different. He wanted a system where he controlled access to the divine, where religion passed through his hands, where he was the mandatory intermediary between heaven and earth, where people depended on him to reach the gods. It wasn't worship of God, it was replacement of God. The historian Flavius Josephus, writing his Antiquities of the Jews in the 1st century after Christ, records ancient traditions about Nimrod that circulated among the Jews of his time. He writes that Nimrod persuaded people not to attribute their happiness to God, but to consider that their own courage was the source of their prosperity. He gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way to turn men from the fear of God than to make them constantly dependent on his own power. Josephus goes on to say that Nimrod declared he would take revenge on God if he tried to flood the world again. He would build a tower too high for the waters to reach and thus avenge the destruction of his ancestors. Even if these details are oral tradition rather than biblical record, they reveal how later generations understood Nimrod, not as an ambitious leader who went too far, but as a conscious, deliberate rebel who wanted to create an alternative to the divine system. This is the anatomy of idolatry. It doesn't begin with statues. It doesn't begin with strange rituals or bloody sacrifices. It begins with a decision in the heart, the decision to put something or someone in the place that belongs only to God. And Nimrod put himself in exactly that place. Ancient traditions, preserved in Sumerian and Babylonian texts, discovered by archaeologists over the last 200 years, speak of a powerful king who defied the heavens in primordial times. The names vary according to culture. Some call him Gilgamesh, the hero of the oldest epic in human literature. Others identify him with Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. Others with Bel, a title meaning Lord. Others with Merodach, a name that appears even in the Bible. But the narrative pattern is always the same. A man who conquered cities, who hunted impossible beasts, including lions and wild bulls, who tried to achieve immortality through his own works, who was eventually worshipped as a god or declared himself divine while still alive. Nimrod didn't just build a political empire, he built a religious system with himself at the center, and that system would become the model for all subsequent idolatry. Then God intervened. Genesis chapter 11, verses 5 to 7. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the sons of men were building. And he said, "Behold, the people are one, and they all have the same language. This is only the beginning. Now nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." Notice the verb. God came down. The tower they wanted to build to the heavens didn't even come close to God. He had to, and come down to see it. There's an almost comical irony in the text. The great tower that represented human ambition was so insignificant from the heavenly perspective that God had to come closer to examine it. But the divine intervention was surgical. God didn't destroy the tower with fire, as he would later do with Sodom. He didn't send another flood, as he had promised he wouldn't. He didn't open the earth to swallow the builders, as he would do with Korah centuries later. He simply touched the language. Suddenly, without warning, the bricklayer couldn't understand the engineer. The supervisor tried to give orders and no one comprehended. Families that had gone to sleep speaking the same language woke up with strange sounds coming out of their mouths, unable to communicate with neighbors who lived across the street. The chaos was immediate and total. How do you continue a construction project when no one understands the instructions? How do you coordinate thousands of workers who can no longer communicate? How do you maintain a unified empire when the very foundation of society, common language, has instantly disappeared? Construction stopped. The project was abandoned, and the city received a new name. The name Babel comes from the Hebrew balal, which means to confuse or to mix. The city that wanted to make a name for itself became forever known by the name God gave it. Confusion, Babel, Babylon. And then exactly what God had commanded from the beginning happened. The people scattered. Groups that discovered they spoke the same language gathered together and migrated. Some went north, following the course of the Euphrates. Others went south toward the Persian Gulf. Others crossed mountains heading east. Others followed the Mediterranean coast westward. Within a few generations, humanity occupied territories stretching from the African plains to the Asian steppes, from the Mediterranean islands to the forests of Europe. The dispersion that God had commanded finally happened, but they took something with them. Here's the detail no one tells when talking about Babel. When the groups dispersed, they didn't leave empty. They didn't start from zero in terms of culture and religion. They carried memories, stories, traditions, fragments of the religious system they had practiced in the shadow of that unfinished tower. And as the groups became isolated, as generations passed without contact with other peoples, those memories became distorted. Details were forgotten. Others were invented to fill gaps. Names changed, stories merged. What was memory became myth. What was history became legend. The Apostle Paul describes this process of religious degradation in Romans chapter 1, verses 21 to 23. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. Instead, their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for images made to look like corruptible man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. This is the complete map of idolatry. The starting point is always knowledge of God, not ignorance, knowledge. The first post-Babel generations knew that a unique creator existed. They had heard the stories of the flood. They knew the accounts of creation, but they chose not to glorify that God. They chose not to give thanks. The second stage is futile speculation. When you reject revealed truth, you need to invent alternatives. Reasonings multiply, philosophies arise, theories are proposed. But without the anchor of divine revelation, everything drifts into darkness. The third stage is the exchange, the deliberate substitution. The true God is exchanged for images. First images of men, which at least still reflect something of the Creator. Then birds, more distant. Then four-footed animals, more distant still. Finally, reptiles, crawling creatures, the most degraded form of worship imaginable. And every civilization that arose after Babel illustrated this pattern with astonishing precision. The Sumerians, who inhabited exactly the region where Babel was built, developed a complex pantheon of gods. Anu was the god of the sky, distant and majestic. Enlil was the god of wind and storms, violent and unpredictable. Enki was the god of waters and wisdom, creator of humanity in their myths. Inanna, later called Ishtar, was the goddess of fertility, love, and war, worshipped with ritual prostitution in her temples. Each Sumerian city had its patron god. Enormous temples dominated the urban center. Priests formed a powerful caste that controlled not only religion, but economics and politics. Offerings were mandatory, rituals were complex. Access to the divine passed exclusively through the hands of authorized intermediaries. And when you examine Sumerian myths, you find distorted echoes of biblical stories. They had an account of a flood preserved in clay tablets that archaeologists discovered in Nineveh. The hero was called Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or Ziusudra in older versions. He built a boat, survived a flood sent by the gods, and afterward received immortality. They had stories of creation, of paradisiacal gardens where the gods dwelt, of serpents that stole immortality from humans, of sacred trees that could not be touched. The memories of Noah were there, the stories of Eden were there, but completely deformed, fragmented, mixed with later inventions. The Egyptians did the same. Ra, the sun god, crossed the sky in his divine boat and descended to the underworld every night to battle the forces of chaos. Osiris, dead and resurrected, reigned over the dead and offered hope of life after death. Isis, his wife and sister, was the mother goddess par excellence, worshipped with intense devotion. Horus, their son, was the falcon god, protector of the pharaohs. The pharaohs declared themselves sons of the gods, divine incarnations on earth, unique intermediaries between Egypt and the heavens. They built pyramids as cosmic staircases, colossal temples with columns 20 meters high, statues weighing hundreds of tons. They mobilized millions of hours of human labor to worship gods they had invented just a few generations earlier. The Canaanites, who occupied the land that God promised to Abraham, worshipped Baal, the god of storms and fertility. Every time it thundered, it was Baal riding the clouds. Every abundant harvest was Baal's blessing, and to ensure his favor, the rituals included sacred prostitution in the temples, where men and women offered themselves as worship to the deity. Ashtoreth, also called Asherah, was Baal's consort. Sacred poles were erected in her honor at the high places, representing the goddess of fertility. The rituals involved sexual practices that the Bible calls abominations. And there was Molech, the god of Ammon, neighbor of Israel. Molech was represented as a bronze statue with a bull's head and outstretched arms. Inside the statue was a furnace. When the fire was lit and the bronze heated up, priests placed babies in the incandescent arms of the idol. Drums beat loudly to drown out the screams. This wasn't primitive superstition of ignorant people living in caves. It was a sophisticated religious system with elaborate theology, priests trained for years, architecturally impressive temples, complex festival calendars, rituals codified in precise details. Civilizations that built engineering marvels, that developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine. These same civilizations burned their own children on bronze altars. It all began at Babel. It all derived from the system Nimrod created. Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, records something that most people don't realize when thinking about the history of Israel. When Joshua, already old, gathered the people to renew the covenant with God, he began by reminding them of their origins. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, your fathers, Terah the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river in ancient times, and they served other gods. Terah was Abraham's father. This means that the very family from which God called the patriarch of Israel was already contaminated by idolatry. Abraham wasn't born in an environment of pure worship of the true God. He didn't grow up in a family that preserved Noah's faith intact. Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, a Mesopotamian city near the site of Babel, where Sin, the moon god, was worshipped with elaborate temples and nocturnal rituals. The idolatry that Nimrod spread had reached the very lineage from which the chosen people would emerge. God had to uproot Abraham from that context. Genesis chapter 12 records the call. Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. The Hebrew verb is emphatic. Leave, separate yourself, leave behind. Abraham needed to leave physically in order to leave spiritually. The contamination was so deep that proximity meant influence. As long as he remained in Ur, surrounded by temples to moon gods, he would never be able to worship only the Creator. But even so, the contamination persisted in subsequent generations. Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, stole her father Laban's household idols when she fled back to Canaan. Genesis chapter 31 records that Laban pursued the entire family to recover his teraphim, his statuettes of household gods. Those pieces of wood or metal meant so much to him that he abandoned everything to search for them. And Rachel lied to protect them. She sat on the idols hidden in the camel's saddle and told her father she couldn't get up because she was in her menstrual period. Within the very patriarchal family, chosen by God to be different, idolatry infiltrated like a weed. When the Israelites went down to Egypt to escape famine, they spent 430 years absorbing the most idolatrous culture in the ancient world. 400 years seeing temples dedicated to hundreds of gods. 400 years living with people who worshipped crocodiles, cats, scarab beetles. 400 years hearing that Pharaoh was a living god. Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 7 records words that God spoke to Israel while still in Egypt before the Exodus. Each of you throw away the abominations before your eyes, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This means that even as slaves, the Israelites had adopted Egyptian idolatrous practices. They kept amulets, they made offerings, they participated in rituals. The contamination was internal, not just external. And 40 days after seeing God descend on Mount Sinai in fire, thunder, lightning, and earthquake, after hearing the divine voice with their own ears, after trembling with fear before the most impressive manifestation of God's power in history, what did they do? A golden calf. Exodus chapter 32 records the episode. Moses was delayed on the mountain. The people grew impatient. They pressured Aaron, and Aaron, the same man who had seen the 10 plagues, who had spoken with God, who would become the first high priest, melted the people's gold earrings and molded a calf. The form was no coincidence. Apis, the sacred bull, was one of the most popular deities in Egypt. It represented strength, fertility, power. The Israelites weren't inventing a new god. They were reproducing exactly what they had seen in Egypt for 400 years. 400 years of cultural immersion had engraved idolatry so deep in their hearts that not even miracles could erase it. Not the plagues, not the parted sea, not the manna falling from heaven, not the water gushing from the rock, not the cloud by day and fire by night. This is the power of the system Nimrod created. It wasn't just theological error that could be corrected with information. It was social architecture, religion controlled by men for the benefit of men, using the name of the gods to manipulate entire populations. And once it takes hold, once it penetrates the culture, it passes from generation to generation like a cursed inheritance. And the pattern spread to every corner of the planet as peoples migrated. The Greeks created Olympus. Zeus, father of gods and men, ruled from the top of the sacred mountain with thunderbolts in hand. Hera, his jealous wife, pursued her husband's lovers. And illegitimate children. Athena, born from Zeus's head already adult and armed, was the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. Apollo drove the chariot of the sun and presided over music, poetry, and prophecy. Aphrodite personified love and desire. Poseidon ruled the seas. Hades reigned over the dead. 12 main gods and dozens of lesser ones, each with personality, history, complex relationships. The Greeks built the Parthenon in Athens, a temple dedicated to Athena, which cost the equivalent of billions in today's values and took 15 years to complete. They used marble from Mount Pentelicus, transported for kilometers. They hired the best sculptors of the era. The Greek philosophers, considered the most brilliant thinkers of antiquity, men like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, offered sacrifices at the altars of these gods. Socrates was condemned to death for, among other charges, not recognizing the gods that the city of Athens recognized. The Romans absorbed the Greek pantheon and added their own layer. Jupiter was Zeus with a Latin name. Mars was Ares. Venus was Aphrodite, Neptune was Poseidon. But the Romans went further. They weren't content with distant gods on Olympus. They deified their emperors. Augustus, the first emperor, was declared divine after his death. Tiberius received divine honors. Caligula demanded to be worshipped as a god while still alive, even ordering that his statue be placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, an order that almost provoked a revolt. Nero, Domitian, others followed the same path. Refusing to offer incense before the emperor's image was a crime of treason, punishable by death. Christians died by the thousands in Roman arenas, not because they worshipped Jesus, but because they refused to worship Caesar. The same pattern as Nimrod, man placing himself in God's place, demanding worship that doesn't belong to him. In pre-Columbian America, civilizations that never had contact with the old world developed astonishingly similar religious systems. The Aztecs tore out the hearts of living prisoners at the top of stepped pyramids, structures reminiscent of Mesopotamian ziggurats, to feed Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war. Estimates based on Spanish records suggest they sacrificed between 20,000 and 80,000 people per year, with peaks during temple consecration periods. The Maya threw victims into sacred cenotes, natural freshwater wells considered portals to the underworld. The Incas offered children in mountain sacrifices called capacocha, leaving them in the frozen heights of the Andes, to die of cold as offerings to the gods. In India, Hinduism developed over millennia, a pantheon of 330 million gods. Literally, 330 million deities catalogued in Hindu scriptures. Temples covered with intricate sculptures showing gods with multiple arms, elephant heads, blue skin, dancing on corpses. Rituals that included everything from peaceful offerings of flowers and fruits to, in certain historical contexts, human sacrifices to Kali, the goddess of destruction. In China, folk religion mixed ancestor veneration with worship of nature forces and gods imported from Buddhism and Taoism. In Japan, Shinto recognized 8 million kami, spirits that inhabited everything from majestic mountains to everyday objects like mirrors and swords. In Africa, each region developed its own systems. Orishas in the Yoruba tradition, Voduns in Dahomey, deified ancestors in virtually all cultures, nature spirits that needed to be appeased with offerings, different geographies, different languages, different histories, completely different names for the gods. But the structure is always identical. Humans creating deities in their own image. Religious systems controlled by priestly castes that monopolize access to the sacred. Intermediaries who charge for access to the divine. Sacrifices to appease invisible forces. Rituals that must be performed correctly to work. All of this began on a plain between two rivers when a man decided he could be his own god. And here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Nimrod didn't invent idolatry out of nothing. He merely systematized, organized, and scaled something that already existed in potential in the human heart since the fall. Before the flood, humanity had already become completely corrupt. Genesis chapter 6 describes an earth filled with violence, where every imagination of the thoughts of the human heart was continually evil. The wickedness wasn't occasional or sporadic. It was continuous, constant, total. Some scholars believe that the sons of God mentioned in Genesis 6 were fallen angels who left their proper dwelling and mingled with human women, fathering the Nephilim, the giants of renown mentioned in the text. Others interpret it as the godly line of Seth mixing with the corrupt line of Cain, diluting faith until it disappeared. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, the result was the same: total corruption of the human race. Only Noah found grace. Only 8 people were saved, and when Noah descended from the ark, he carried with him the fallen human nature. The flood cleansed the earth, swept away the corrupted civilization, eliminated the violent and ungodly, but it didn't cleanse the heart. The seed of sin remained present, transmitted from father to son. Ham, one of Noah's 3 sons who survived the flood, demonstrated this shortly after. Genesis chapter 9 records the shameful episode in which Noah planted a vineyard, made wine, drank too much, and lay drunk and uncovered inside his tent. Ham saw his father's nakedness and went out to tell his brothers outside. Shem and Japheth reacted differently. They took a garment, put it on both their shoulders, walked in backwards so they wouldn't see, and covered their father. When Noah woke up and learned what had happened, he pronounced a curse, but not directly on Ham. On Canaan, Ham's son. Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. Many scholars believe there was more to this story than the text explicitly reveals. The curse was too severe for mere gossip. Something more serious happened in that tent, and whatever it was, it marked Ham's lineage with a shadow that would persist for generations. And Cush, Nimrod's father, was Ham's son, the lineage from which came the first tyrant, the first empire builder, the first systematizer of idolatry, was the same lineage that carried the curse pronounced by Noah. This isn't coincidence. It's pattern. Rebellion against God is transmitted. It passes from father to son. It takes root in families, in clans, in entire nations, unless someone chooses to break the cycle. Because idolatry isn't inevitable destiny, it's repeated choice. Abraham came from an idolatrous family, from a city dedicated to moon gods, and became the father of faith. Not because he was better than others, because he responded when God called. Rahab was a Canaanite, a direct descendant of the culture that sacrificed children to Moloch, a prostitute in a city destined for destruction. And she entered the lineage of the Messiah because she hid the Israelite spies and declared that the God of Israel was the true God of heaven and earth. Ruth was a Moabite, a people that arose from incest between Lot and his daughter, who worshipped Chemosh with rituals that included human sacrifice. And she became the great-grandmother of David, the man after God's own heart, because she chose to follow her mother-in-law back to Israel, declaring that Naomi's God would be her God. Idolatry isn't a matter of genetics. It isn't a matter of cultural origin. It isn't destiny written in the stars. It's a matter of choice. Each generation decides whether to repeat the pattern or break it. Each individual decides whether to follow Nimrod's path or Abraham's path. Historians identify the same cycle in every civilization that arose and disappeared over the millennia. First comes the memory of the divine. Some knowledge, however fragmented, that something exists beyond the visible, someone who created everything. Then comes the attempt to control it, to systematize access, to create intermediaries, to transform the sacred into a tool of power. Finally, complete substitution. The original creator is forgotten. Human creations take his place. The Sumerians did this, the Egyptians did this, Greeks, Romans, Persians, Aztecs, Maya, Incas, Chinese, Indians, Africans, Europeans, all repeated the cycle with local variations. And each one believed their gods were different, more real, more powerful, more worthy of worship. What Babel began never stopped multiplying. The tower remained unfinished, but the system it represented spread across every continent, every culture, every generation. Idolatry isn't a closed chapter of ancient history, an archaeological curiosity to study in museums. It's a human pattern that continuously reinvents itself, and perhaps the most uncomfortable question isn't how idolatry was born, but why we've never managed to free ourselves from it.